KCYBLP 103.5 FM is Cypress Radio. Cypress.
Live from Cypress, Texas, you've tuned in to the Special Education 504 Radio Hour. And I'm your host, Louis Geigerman. Well, we've been talking about baseball every week before we start the show, and we're going to do it again this week. The Astros are still in first place. They're now 3.5 games ahead of the Los Angeles Angels and 4 over the surging Texas Rangers. So, in fact, tonight the Astros are going to be playing the Dodgers, and so it's a big series. But the Astros are still in first place, and we're in the dog days of August. So go Astros. The other piece of news is that the Dream League, which is the team for kids, well, the special needs baseball league, they're going to the Little League World Series, as I've told you, to play an exhibition game next Saturday morning. The big controversy has been they're going to be playing it's not a controversy that they're playing the exhibition game before the international game, but the big controversy is that the local public broadcasting station, WVIA, was going to be televising it live in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and they had offered the rights to the local PBS station here in Houston, KUHT. Well, the good news is that KUHT has decided to go ahead and televise the game after all, and on a tape delay basis. It's going to really depend on when the local Pearland team here in Houston plays and when the other team plays. But the long and short of it is it's going to be televised here in Houston, and all your calls, your letters to the local affiliate worked, because on Tuesday the director understood that they were going to televise it. So I want to give kudos to Channel 8 for making the right decision to televise the game. We need to celebrate the fact that these kids are there. It's really an amazing thing. The kids, the parents, the angels that assist them. This team raised over $100,000 to send these kids to Williamsport. As a matter of fact, the local minor league team out in Sugar Land, the Skeeters, are giving them a send-off, I believe, tomorrow, which is going to be really cool, and wish them well. So this is really a big deal. These kids are really just beaming from their smiles are just beaming, and everybody feels good. Channel 13 did a wonderful story on it too. That's KTRK Houston. You can look up on their website, and I believe it's still archived in there. Just put in the Dream League story that they did the other day. It was really a fabulous thing. Well, let's see now. Monday here in Houston and across Texas, school is starting, so I guess we're getting back into the IEP meetings, ARD meetings here, Section 504 meetings. So we're all kind of getting geared up for getting our planning for our kids this year. So I imagine that's on everybody's mind, and we're going to have a really, really great guest today. We're going to have Dr. Peter Simone, who is a neuropsychologist that does testing. He also does therapy. He's an amazing guy, and he's going to give you a lot of insight into how he does testing. And what we're going to do before I bring him on is we're going to go to a brief break, and then I'm going to put him on. He's by phone. He's going to be interviewed. So we're going to go to a short break, and then we'll bring on Dr. Peter Simone. So stay tuned.
This is a guided meditation on parenting. Take this time to breathe deeply and close your eyes. Right now, you're completely in control. Unlike the time you and your son played basketball and you attempted to slam dunk, or when you tried removing those raccoons from the basement. Concentrate on the soothing sound of my voice. Release the memory of when you wrestled with that beehive in your son's treehouse. Let go of the time you thought that skunk was a cat, or when you pulled into the garage with your son's bike on top of the car. Deep breaths. Deep breaths.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of teens in foster care who don't need perfection. They need you. For more information on how you can adopt, visit adoptuskids.org. A public service announcement from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Hey, what's up? Thinking about you. XOXOXO. Want to snuggle. ... JK. Hit me back. You getting these texts? ? We should hang later. I miss you. Holla at ya, boy. Holla back. Holla back. Holla back. Are you at home? Where are you? What are you doing? OMG. You are making me mad. Are you with your ex? You better text me back. I'm waiting outside your house.
Relentless, aggressive texting is like sending an angry robot to deliver your message. When does the robot become dangerous? Let us know at that'snotcool.com.
That'snotcool.com.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Okay, we're back. Today we have Dr. Peter Simone, who, I'll give you a little background on Peter. He got his PhD from the University of Texas. I kid him about that every now and then because, with OU there. He got his master's from Southwest Texas. I guess that's now called Texas State. I had a kid that went there. Let's see, you got your BA from Gettysburg College. You're a licensed psychologist and LSSP. You're also a certified mediator. Let's see, you were a founding board member of a private school here in Houston. Is that still around?
Yes, Gateway Academy.
Gateway Academy, I've heard of that. Also, you've done some work in hospitals as well. Let's see, you've also performed some work in residential treatment centers. You've been in private practice for 11 years. You've been a licensed psychologist for 15 years, and you were a licensed professional counselor since originally licensed in 1994. And let's see, you're married and you have 2 kids and you live here in Houston. Does that about cover it?
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
Well, that's cool. Well, Peter, I just want to welcome you to the Special Ed Section 504 Radio Hour.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, man. One of the things that I've always found really fascinating about you is really, in your practice, in what you do regarding executive functioning. And I think there is a real misunderstanding, not only from parents, but I think also from schools, that they really don't understand the importance of executive functioning, or really they don't even know what it is. Let's have a conversation about what executive functioning is and how does it impact learning.
Okay. Executive functions are, if we consider the term executive, you think about somebody who is at the top tier of an organization and is utilizing the various components of the organization, human resources, accounting, marketing, so on, to set goals for the business, to assess productivity, to assess decision-making in terms of how to guide that business forward into the future, how to make it effective, how to make it survive, how to make it grow. Similarly, the idea is with the organization of the executive system, it's to guide the ability of the individual to make choices to facilitate independence, healthy functioning, growth, safety at basic levels. So it's part of the brain that's the cortex that is really the highest order of functioning of our brain systems. Other parts of the brain control autonomic functioning. Other parts control like memory and emotional functioning, sensory inputs, motor control, motor balance, and so forth. The executive system is designed to organize and direct the choices that people make, to learn from the experiences and to utilize those experiences going forward. The cortical system that's involved, one of the reasons it's so important is it's also connected to all the other parts of these brain functioning. So it's involved in things like how do you modulate your emotions, how do you direct your attention, as well as learning, developing concepts and rules. So, for example, you think of, given my age, one of my go-tos would be Homer Simpson. There's a particular cartoon of Homer in my mind that goes through where he touches a hot stove and goes, ouch, and then touches it again. Okay, so we have a learning function in there. We have pain involved. His repeated touching of the stove would suggest that he is demonstrating poor executive functioning. In this case, he's not connecting the dots between his behavior and the outcome, and he's not generating a rule of one should not touch a hot stove or it will cause pain to guide his future behavior. So that would be in a kind of a nutshell what we're kind of thinking about when we're looking at executive functioning.
Let me expand upon that for a minute.
Please.
Usually, I've heard a further example of what executive functioning is that imagine an air traffic controller for your brain.
Mm-hmm.
You've got all these planes in the air. You've got to figure out what's happening. Well, that's effectively what executive functioning is. You agree with that, right?
Well, yeah. That particular example really speaks to some of the benefits, some of the activities, particularly with selective attention, prioritization, attention shifting, that is really critical elements of executive functioning. It doesn't necessarily give as much descriptive power to the idea of kind of the planning, the learning from experience, the setting priorities, that would also be embedded in kind of the executive metaphor. But they're both metaphors to kind of describe some of these elements that that executive functions use to guide and shape our behavior and our choices.
I know when you typically do assessments for this, and obviously if this has an impact on, on organizing, attention shifting, all of these things are important regarding, somebody's attention to material and keeping on task. Typically what I see as an instrument that a lot of schools use is they use an inventory called the brief, which really asks for an opinion of the person that's observing the student, how they're functioning in these particular areas. But they're not really testing. Furthermore, if you're having somebody that's like a teacher well, a parent may see a kid, more closely, but a teacher may have a room full of other kids, and it's kind of hard to really, focus on that kid constantly through that time. But you're asking for an opinion, and you're not really going one-on-one and testing the kid. Contrast that to using a more of a diagnostic method to determine it, such as the Dellis-Kaplan executive functioning system. Can you contrast those two, and which do you prefer?
All right. So let me break it down a little bit to a little bit more. Because when we're looking at some of the diagnostic elements, we're also looking at, what are we trying to assess? So for example, when we're looking at executive functioning, we're looking at things like your ability to develop concepts, and from concepts to develop rules. So, for example, with the Homer Simpson's example, is then I can generate, not only shouldn't I touch a hot stove, but I shouldn't touch any other hot stove, not just this one. So its ability then to generalize from my learning a concept that allows me to develop rules that can guide and shape my information, whether it's how do I organize biology material under categories to know species, genus, and so forth. It also gets to my ability to engage in what's called attention shifting. So attention shifting is, can I go from one thing to another relatively smoothly? Can I let go, for example, of I'm trying a procedure that's not working, and can I let go of that procedure to try something new or differently? Can I shift my attention from going from one activity to another? One of the opposite type behaviors that one would see, people that have difficulty with flexibility, is a tendency to be rigid or even obsessive. So that's really important. The ability to shift attention, for example, in a school environment, is a critical piece, not only for you to develop new learning, but also to prioritize the information that's coming to you. Teacher calls you, you need to look up, so on and so forth. It's time to shift classes. It's having a new piece of information that's going to change your paradigm of what I'm approaching. I've done mathematics in a horizontal thing, and now we're going to go in a vertical format, which will help me teach me regrouping. So the attention shifting is really a key element, and part of that is obviously being able to prioritize. So if I'm reading a book while I'm walking, stopping and looking at the road before I cross it is not only am I attention shifting, but I'm prioritizing my safety over the reading material. The ability to look forward, to anticipate, to see more than one possible alternative is an important element, just as the ability to reflect on previous learning and to bring that previous learning into my current choices and or for planning in the future. It also ties into your ability to modulate your emotions, as well as to organize yourself, both in terms of time, space, materials, tasks, and so forth. So this is a really broad term, and there are a number of pieces for it. You're typically looking at things when you're doing assessment, but one of the important pieces is what's called working memory, and that's your ability. Most people are familiar with long-term memory, things they've learned a while ago, they're able to pull up. People are usually aware of short-term memory, which means that some recent information you're able to recall it quickly. But memory systems are more complex about that, and they're divided into different subsystems that can work to varying degrees independent of each other. The working memory system is your ability to hold information in your brain while you're performing some operation on it. So a typical example of that would be, for example, doing a math problem in your head. You have to hold the information up, but then perform some operation on it. So obviously math, that would show itself. In reading, it would be Why is that person doing that? Did I understand that concept? It gets to your ability to self-monitor and reflect upon what you're doing at the moment and also have some awareness of it. So there's a number of different pieces when we're talking about executive functioning and executive functioning assessment. And there's a continuum when we're looking at the assessment. So some of the tools you mentioned, for example, like the Dallas Kaplan, and there's another one like the NEPSI. There's been a
NEPSI 2 NEPSI 2 is one that I see a lot in the schools.
Right. Those are instruments that are trying to assess the relative performance of these abilities through specific tasks that are designed to measure those abilities as closely as they can. One of the advantages of those tests is they're done in what's called the standardized format, which means that you do the test to the individuals in the same way, and that therefore lets you compare relative to performance and lets you make statements about relative performance. They're also normed, which means that you are able to compare performance relative to other individuals that age, which gives you an idea of that person's relative abilities or performance compared to other people of the same developmental age. Those are very important elements of the assessment process. The other elements are also the correspondence between how somebody does in testing and how they do in their real life. And that's where things like the rating scales, questionnaires, history, parent report, interviews come into play. The rating scales, like the brief that you mentioned, which is probably due for an update, and there are other executive functioning rating scales coming out. I believe Jack Naglieri came out with one last year. What they try to do is provide a systematic way to compare relative performance of executive function in the environment, and they provide similar norms by which other people compare against them. Some of the problems that you mentioned in terms of impact of the observer, relative ability of the observer to differentiate what they're seeing in terms of is this situational versus characteristic of the person's ability, their ability to ferret out environmental versus information specific to the individual. Yeah, they're all concerns of those instruments, but they help provide information in terms of what we're looking at, in terms of what is the person actually doing in the environment, because there's a lot of things that can occur between assessment of the skills and how those skills manifest in an actual environment, because there's so many other factors that can come into play that can affect performance.
Well, let me ask you this, okay? So you're saying there is a role for those rating scales and for those inventories, but if that is to see where they are in the real world, well, that's fine, but a lot of institutions are using that solely as a way of measuring the executive functioning versus using a scale like the NEPSI 2, not a scale, but a diagnostic instrument like the NEPSI 2 or the Dallas Kaplan as a way of testing. In other words, would you want to rely solely by the brief as being a way of determining what somebody's executive functioning is?
Hold on for 1 second. Well, to rely solely, no, and part of the reason is that there can be a number of factors that can affect one's executive functioning, and executive functions that may or may not result directly from the relative skill or development in that area. So, for example, in general, most people's executive functioning grades under stress. if you're under a high level of stress, if you've not been sleeping, if you're having problems with mood or depression, it can certainly compromise your executive functions, your ability to function in those ways. And so just relying on like an instrument such as a rating scale, you're not getting enough information to make a diagnostic conclusion, though it can provide you screening information that can be helpful. Okay. Yes.
Okay, that's great. Well, I want to expand upon this a little bit. I want to talk about executive functioning. We touched on it a bit, but I want to explore it even more. You know, so many families that listen to this show have kids that have attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit, and I want to talk about ADHD and its component of executive functioning. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the type of programming or accommodations that are typical that should be considered. A lot of times when I see a child that has ADHD, of course it's the issue on eligibility regarding the severity. But where things are discovered about the student, about the severity and how it impacts their ability to learn, is really greatly impact. The executive functioning is really the core or the source of the problem. Would you expand on that, and B, talk about the type of accommodations that we would look at, or the type of programming that we would typically look at to assist, and walk through areas like processing. There could be kids could have a problem with processing. They could have a problem with working memory, attention shifting. Walk through the types of accommodations or programming, even the type of IEP goals that we should think about when drafting it for a kid that has attention deficit.
Okay. I would like to point out that particular question could probably span a volume of books.
Well, that's why I asked. That's why I asked it. I got to fill time. What can I do?
How many days do you have?
Well, I have. Let's put it this way. I've got about 33 minutes for the rest of the show.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So let's see. So first of all, let's start with kind of a bigger picture here. Is when we're looking at things like ADHD. ADHD falls into particularly. Okay, I'm going to back up even more. When we're looking at qualifications and diagnosis, we have to consider that there's really two languages that are involved, and they overlap, but they're not the same. And that's the language of the education system under the legal documents of IDEA, the federal laws of IDEA, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is 504. So there is a process and a diagnostic description that's embedded in that language. And then there's the clinical language. And in the clinical language, there's two subsets. One is the International Classification System, and the other is the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which the new version 5 came out last year. Actually, the ICD-10 came out last year as well. And those overlap, but they're not in perfect concordance. So, for example, Asperger's disorder, which is an autistic spectrum disorder, has been eliminated from DSM-5, but is included in the ICD-10. So there's different languages going on in terms of what qualification, what diagnosis means, and for people out there that are struggling with a school issue and have a clinical diagnosis that may or may not be accepted by the school. Okay. Having said that, I should have used some time up there for you. The DSM would look at and I believe the ICD-10 classifies it as well, the autism spectrum disorders as the ADHD, learning disabilities, communication disorders, intellectual disability, movement disorders, which is like Tourette's and so forth, all under the classification as a neurodevelopmental disorder. Okay, which basically means you're born with this. This is part of your brain development, your brain functioning, and it's not something that you acquire later on in life. Executive functions describe the functioning of your abilities in these relative areas, and these, however, executive function challenges can result from neurodevelopmental delays or difficulties, but they can also be acquired, such as a car accident, through as well as degenerative disorders, or something, for example, like neurodegenerative disorder can affect it as well. Executive functioning problems are strongly associated with a number of specific disorders, which include Hello?
Yeah, are you there?
You still there?
Yeah, I'm
sorry,
still here.
Mike.
That's okay.
Okay. Which include ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and others as well. But in terms of for children and school populations, those are certainly two of the largest. In fact, executive functioning problems were really brought to, in my opinion, into more of the public awareness through an ADHD researcher. I want to say Charles Barkley, but his name is Russell Barkley.
He doesn't play basketball, I assume.
He doesn't play basketball, but Charles Barkley did. It was very good. And really helped delineate those challenges. And you're right that the executive functioning component, for some people, can be more of the issue in terms of impairment in functioning, which may be due to how the ADHD manifests in the environment, how the autism, or the ADHD responds to like medication treatment, but there's not a medication treatment for the executive dysfunction. So in some cases, it could be that the real problem for the child is related to, listen, I can't seem to get my understanding of time, so that I'm constantly putting things off, or I'm constantly losing things. I can't get my work into my bag, and I can't get my bags at home, or I can't get my homework completed back to school. And how that manifests will also vary on kind of the degree of challenges in the environment. For example, a high school student is going to have more executive challenges going on, both in terms of curriculum and demand, than an elementary school student would. So they may manifest in a different fashion.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, please go on.
Well, okay. So what I'd like to know is, well, a couple of things. Of course, when you're diagnosing, well, from a neuropsychological perspective, besides doing the executive function, doing an executive functioning evaluation, such as the NEPSI-2 or the Dellis-Kaplan, along with the brief. I believe another instrument would be to use like the Connors. I believe that's another rating scale. That using the Connors as an example. And what I want to know is, and correct me if I'm wrong about that, And also, I'm interested in the types of accommodations and programming that we need to look at for these kids. What would we do to remediate or accommodate, if you will? I don't know if we really ever fix it, but we certainly help people navigate or adjust to it. Accommodations and or goals and objectives that you, just off the top of your head, to deal with issues from working memory to organizational skills to processing. What are the types of things that we should write into a plan?
Okay, so the first step is a good evaluation, and the purpose of the evaluation is really to delineate the strengths and weaknesses, to describe, as well as to rule out other potential issues or problems, and from that, use that information to help devise a plan. And a plan can include a plan to remediate, develop the skills or areas of deficit. It can be make suggestions in terms of modifications that may help improve performance. It also can describe accommodations that can be used to help improve performance as well. Now, the recommendations are going to vary depending upon what we're looking at as the area of problem or problems. One of the challenges with some of the executive functioning is not just what are the kind of the primary areas that are impacted. So, for example, the difficulty with connecting the dots, the ability to shift fluidly and so forth, the ability to develop concept formation, but also what are the kind of secondary or tertiary problems that can develop. So, for example, somebody who has challenges with looking ahead into the future, who has difficulty seeing more than one option, has difficulty placing themselves in the future in terms of that type of thinking, planning, and the prioritization that goes with it, often will have difficulties with delayed gratification and motivation. Now, those are not directly tied to the executive functions, but they may be important factors in terms of if we're going to work on this, we also have to consider these elements in terms of the program design, because if we're asking somebody to do something or do something differently or to work harder on something and they have little to no motivation, that can generate a whole other set of problems. So getting some ideas in terms of how to approach those different areas will really help what our program's going to look like.
Well, okay, that's real helpful. Help me on an, and I understand you have to look at what's underneath that particular deficit. But let's look at working memory for a minute. Okay, if we know an individual has a low working memory, okay. Mm-hmm. What do we? Right. There are basic things that we can do as an accommodation to at least accommodate that difficulty. It's hardwired. Well, I think you'll agree that it's a hardwired problem. It's part of who they are. But how do we accommodate with that deficit to allow that? Because there's a clear storage problem. What do we do about that?
Well, okay, so we have a clear idea of the working memory deficits because we've done a good assessment. Mm-hmm. We delineated, is this primarily a visual issue? Is this an auditory, verbal issue? Is it, because those systems can be different, is it spatial motor? Mm-hmm. we've ruled out that it's not just inattention, so it's hard to do working memory unless you're getting the input in. So if we're having problems with just the recall element or the attentional part, we're not getting the information in then to work on. But if we rule that out, we say, okay, that's pretty good. It really is a let's say, verbal working memory issue. What do we do then? And there's a few directions that we can go. There are some, for example, some computerized training instruments out there that unfortunately don't have as yet a clear empirical basis or evidence for their effectiveness. But they're out there. They've been in development, and
they sure are making. They're sure making claims that they raise working memory, though. They're sure claiming that.
Well, yes, but as you know, there's there's a lot of people out there telling you that they can cure baldness and everything else if you just give them 1995 and so on and so forth. So the claims and the evidence, I guess one of the difference would be is that some of these systems are actually being researched, and where you want to get to is, are they being researched by people that don't have financial interest in selling the product?
Exactly.
And that part we're starting to get to. That's been a problem with medications. They've actually only recently started to make some changes with some of the protocols in terms of how medication effectiveness is being assessed, and so people aren't changing their outcome variables in the middle of the research protocol because they weren't getting the results they wanted.
But things like exactly.
Yeah.
So here's another way of looking at it. Okay, let's say the kid's having difficulty recalling information, and as you said before, you said previously that that has a bigger. It really comes to roost in math most typically with a working memory problem, or in reading. But let's say in math, what about externalizing information so they don't, as a way of accommodating that? That's just a thought.
Well, it's going to come across in every element of academics. Reading comprehension would be a huge one. But so one thing is I mentioned that a computerized research element. Another part would be working on the child to develop what's called their self-talk, their ability to, okay, what did I just hear? Did I understand it? And to convert that into an internal narrative that helps provide a buffer that they can then go back and check on. Somebody with working memory, particularly verbal working memory difficulties, they're going to have to learn how to use systems in which to hold and retain information so they can process it. So writing it down in various structures or various formats is going to be something that would be very helpful to somebody with a working memory problem trying to do that information in their head as opposed to being able to put it on paper where they can, where it doesn't disappear on them, will help provide them a way to manage that. Teacher modifications, educational modifications would be, for example, letting the person have notes. Public schools in Houston are going to the point of allowing students to have copies of lectures that they can review online at later dates. Teachers checking for comprehension by asking the student to repeat what they heard, and this is an important distinction, not just parroting what they heard, but saying what they heard in their own words. It allows the teacher to check the child's understanding and comprehension of what was heard, because by putting it in their own words, it requires the child to process it as opposed to just parrot it. because with the parrot, we're just really looking at their recall, we're not really getting, did they really comprehend it? So those would be some of the elements that could be included in a plan for somebody who is having working memory difficulties.
That's a great point. Have them put it in their own words. That's great. I think that's a great accommodation. Regarding note-taking assistance, what do you think about? A lot of schools will say, "Well, we'll give them the notes, but we want to try to help them attend to a certain point, and have a fill in the blank. Give them the notes, but leave out words." So that they'll be looking for those words during the lecture and have a fill in the blank. What do you think about that?
Well, one of the problems with I think education is note taking is actually a pretty complex and very important a skill to develop, and there are things that improve ability to understand and recall, and other methods that are less effective. And most children aren't taught exactly how to do so. So the idea of having a structure such as we're going to provide this child notes, and if you're talking about we're just going to leave certain things blank first, that would seem to be missing the point. The idea is we want to teach the child how to do this. So providing them the notes, but also how do you identify what the main idea is? How do you identify the main point? If the next step or a step in that process is leaving certain information blank for them to fill out, who's going to then circle the wagon and make sure that that information is actually there, that the child then actually heard it, that the child put it in the right context? So the idea of moving from the notes, for example, to an outline, to providing the child a way to have less structure over time as they acquire the skill would seem to be kind of a reasonable sequence to develop those note-taking abilities. So you go from pages of notes to an outline of notes, I'm being very general here, to a blank page being the end goal where they can do that themselves would be the idea of kind of a scope and sequence in terms of how are we going to teach this skill, as opposed to just for some reason assuming that people are going to pick it up.
Yeah, because that's the way it usually is. It's just they give them notes and that's it. You're suggesting, so you're saying the sequence, teach them how to get the main idea. It's okay to do notes and then dial back with an outline and then a blank piece of paper and then go from there.
Yeah, depending on the student, where you start is going to depend on kind of where they're at, their age, their developmental, their other issues, so on and so forth. But yeah, there's a sequence there that teaches the child, okay, writing down every bit of information is not going to be very effective for you down the road. It's not necessarily implying that you're learning the material. So how do you identify what's important, what's not? How do you develop an idea of what you know or what you don't know? How do you identify the idea of how one concept or idea is related to another? Are really the important issues of taking notes beyond what is this person going to test me on, which, that's important as well. But if you're going to teach the skill, you should have a scope and curriculum in terms of, okay, well, what are the steps? What is the information we need to know? And then how do we move to the point to the person being as independent as possible?
That's a great point. That's really a great point. That's kind of blowing away some of my thoughts on this subject. So I'm really glad we got into that. That's a great conversation on it. I want to shift.
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, I would just suggest that's not magic or anything. That's just that idea should really be part of how we approach, our educational planning and our objectives in general. Mm-hmm. We get for the assessment, what is the level of skills, where we want to get to, and how do we provide in educational language the scaffolding with support that we can reduce over time as the child internalizes those skills so they become less dependent upon other people or an external structure. And then they get the ideas of what's important, what they need to do.
We need to start that back in grade school, in elementary school for sure.
Well, that should be what the text is about, and what are the basic skills we need to know? Where is it we need to get to? What are the spaces we need to get to? The concern is that sometimes with accommodations or modifications, it's like when you start a child on a medication and you just leave them on it. We want to think about of the accommodation and modifications as being how do they get us to the goal. For some kids that might not be. There may be a modification that they need that, and that will always be the case. But we should be thinking about how to reduce the amount of modifications and accommodations so that the student can be as independent and as effective as they can.
Absolutely. I want a shift. We're doing a topic shift as opposed to an attention shift. Okay. Maybe it is an attention shift. We want to touch for a few minutes on specific learning disabilities. Okay. Okay. In general, how are they diagnosed? It would be a little difficult to talk about all the different types of accommodations because it really depends on what the problem is. But in general, how do we diagnose learning disabilities? And give me an example of a few that we typically look at, and a couple examples of how we treat.
So first of all, I mentioned before that we have our different languages going on. We have the clinical language, and we have the educational language. In the clinical language, they're called specific learning disabilities, and you're really looking at, is it impairment in reading, is it impairment in written expression, or is it impairment in mathematics? And there's various qualifiers. It can be broken down. For example, mathematics could be number sense, memorization, facts, fluency, or math reasoning. There's a different language in the educational environment. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And in the educational language, those procedures are determined by federal law, that's then interpreted as state law, and then filters down to the local district and school. In terms of the assessment process for that, and those categories are different in the educational process than they are in the
clinical.
The clinical one, but there is an overlap, okay? And so in general, we're looking at like mathematics, and we're looking at reading, we're looking at writing. In school environment, we're also considering things like oral expression and listening comprehension. We're looking at different components in terms of how they relate to each other. So, for example, with reading disorder, or also referred to at times as dyslexia, there can be different components of it that have to be treated differently, but can build upon each other and impact each other, and also can present differently depending on one's age. So, for example, typically what we're looking at with reading disorders is problems with sound to symbol correspondence. So, for example, when we're learning our letters, knowing what an A is and a B is and a C is not really as important as knowing what a B sounds like and what a C sounds like and what a D sounds like. And then we're learning how to understand what they mean when they're grouped together. And then we're looking at elements of what are called morphemes and different elements, small bits of language, and how they relate to words. And then, of course, we're attaching word meaning to them. So when we're looking at reading and reading development, we're looking at your phonologic awareness, your ability to decode and understand the sounds and how they break down. We're looking at your ability to develop a vocabulary and understand word meaning. And then we're also looking at your ability to understand and comprehend reading, which includes things like the order of words and so on and so forth and how they relate to each other. But it becomes very difficult, for example, that if you have real difficulty with the phonological and the phonetics end, that there can be a cascading effect that can impact your reading comprehension because you're having hard times with those types of basic word relationships. It can impact your ability to read words and understand with your word acquisition. It can make it very difficult then to read with any fluency, and consequently your ability, because you don't have many words, it's very effortful to break down words. It can really negatively impact your ability to comprehend your reading because you're spending so much time and effort chunking slowly and effortlessly through blocks of the reading. However, there are people that can have well-developed sound-symbol relationships but have more difficulty with the fluency or difficulty with the reading comprehension. So within each group of challenge, there are subgroups that can impact and have different types of interventions that are required. Okay, so somebody, for example, can have good understanding of math but not be able to retain their times tables in their head. So while they could perform a calculation or a math, is that if they don't have a way to access that information, they're going to make calculation errors or are going to stop or give up because they're just not able to access the information they need to solve the more complex problem that they're actually capable of doing.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I answered your question or not.
Well, you did. I mean, we were talking about, the other part of it was how they're diagnosed. I don't know if I can go deep into that now because we're getting now toward the end. Just, if there's anything, can you think of anything that we didn't talk about that would be important that, we can add here in the next minute or so that parents need to be aware of? One thing for sure, when we're talking about ADHD, I'd say this now, that if somebody has ADHD and we're looking for eligibility for the public schools, it needs to be under the under health impaired eligibility in IDEA, and that can only be done by a medical professional. So it's got to be by an MD. So a psychologist can't do it ultimately and sign off on the paperwork. But other than that, do you have anything in passing in the next minute that you want to briefly, say that?
Well,
yeah,
a psychologist can make the assessment because the way the federal law is written, a physician has to sign off on the qualification paper. So, that's very true, and part of the confusing elements of some of the steps and how some of this is laid out. I think one part is for individuals that are having a struggle with their district or their school system in terms of qualification or services. I think there's a big emphasis within the system to try to make this a collaborative environment. However, unfortunately, it always doesn't turn out to be that way. I think one thing the parents have to realize is that while there's this educational piece and this clinical piece, there's also an overriding legal piece, that they're operating under a system that's defined by legal rules, and educating yourself about that process and understanding that that's what's driving a lot of the paperwork that they're seeing, how things are organized in terms of the discussion, who shows up at meetings, is going to be really important for them to be effective advocates or to obtain effective advocates for their child.
I think that's absolutely true. Well, look, we're really at the end of the show, Peter. Listen, I want to, this has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, I think the discussion of executive functioning is, really just incredible. This show will be archived on the website for anybody that's listening. I hope you'll, because I think we've only scratched the surface on a number of issues. I hope you'll consider coming back on the show again with me, because I think you have phenomenal information to share, and I hope you'll come back. I want to thank you for being on the show with us, and be careful out there, and thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, Peter. All right, be well.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'd be glad to be back whenever you invite me.
Well, that's a plan, man. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
We're now toward the end of the show. Peter was wonderful. Next week we're going to have Gail Evans, who's an occupational therapist that's phenomenal. We'll be talking about sensory processing. Anything you want to know about OT, Gail is going to be there to be able to answer. So next week, stay tuned. Be on same time next week, 10 o'clock Central. If you don't want to hear about it, don't do it. Meaning, I'm talking about the special ed people. Anyway, but please please listen to the show next week. I'll look for you next week, and I'll be seeing you on the radio. Have a great week.
KCYBLP 103.5 FM is Cypress Radio. Cypress.
It's radio like you've never heard before. A free-form flamethrower. 22,000 milliwatts of power. Cypress Radio 103.5.